afternoon and welcome to this July 22nd, 2020 City Council work session. Thank you for joining us in this remote meeting format we're using in response to Governor Brown's Stay Home, Save Lives order. This format enables the City Council to meet and take care of business while keeping its members, staff, and the public safe. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And as always, other avenues of communication with me and city councilors are available, including email and voicemail. And thank you again for joining us. You may have noticed, and council is aware, that we had a slight agenda adjustment this time, postponing a conversation about Northwest Natural. And I'm going to ask the city attorney if she would just speak to that for a minute and explain why that happened.
Absolutely. Good afternoon. Northwest Natural Gas is challenging the council's legal authority to meet in executive session to discuss with the city's negotiating team the terms on which the council is willing to allow Northwest Natural Gas to use its right-of-way. And while I disagree with that legal position, I also don't have any concerns with council having that discussion in open session for a couple of reasons. One being that based on when the franchise agreement is set to expire, we're gonna need some very specific direction out of council on how you want to proceed, and that direction would have needed to be made in open session. And so having the conversation and the next steps being likely an ordinance of some sort, which would obviously be public and subject to public hearing and all that good stuff. So what we've done is we've rescheduled it for next Wednesday, and we will have that work session on it, and you'll have some options presented to you. It'll be a public work session and open session. And because of this kind of late breaking change, Ethan's AIS to you on this will likely not be in your bigger council packet for next week, but you'll get that separately.
Thank you very much. That brings a lot of clarity to everybody. We appreciate it. And so now we will move to our remaining item of on the agenda, Middle Housing Code amendments, and I will turn that over to the manager.
Thank you, Mayor. I assume that I am going to just have Terry Harding kick off her presentation, right? Okay, perfect.
Great. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So good afternoon. We're really happy to be here today. I'm Terry Harding. I'm the principal planner for community planning and design, and I'm leading this middle housing project, and we'll be giving your update today along with Sophie McGinley, an assistant planner who's helping out with our public involvement. We also have a larger team meeting regularly that includes planners, designers, and Lauren Summers from our city attorney's office. Today, we'll be talking about House Bill 2001 and how the city will implement it. We'll talk through the timeline, which includes a state set deadline for adopting code changes. And then we'll present our draft public involvement plan, which we took to the Eugene Planning Commission in June. Today, we're asking for your feedback so we can refine the public involvement plan before taking it back to the Planning Commission to approve it at a meeting in August. The overall goal of the Middle Housing Project is to increase housing options in Eugene, in alignment with the House Bill's goal of increasing housing options across Oregon. In addition, the project will further ongoing work aimed at addressing equity and affordability. As you may recall, the first pillar of Envision Eugene is to provide housing affordable to all income levels. Housing equity can be thought of as increasing people's access to housing free from discrimination and exclusion. The Middle Housing Project helps enable housing availability and diversity, furthering the aim of the Housing Tools and Strategies process completed in 2018. And importantly, our work on middle housing will support our long-term community recovery efforts in the wake of COVID-19. So what's in this House bill? The full bill is in your packets, and here's a super high level summary. Oregon cities over 25,000 population are required to allow middle housing types in areas that allow single detached dwellings. The middle housing types are duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, and townhouses. The law includes a requirement that cities must allow duplexes to be built on each lot within a city. Triplexes, quads, cottage clusters, and townhouses must be allowed in residential areas that allow detached single dwellings, but not necessarily on every lot or parcel. The Department of Land Conservation and Development is responsible for developing a model middle housing code. Simultaneously, DLCD is also developing minimum standards for compliance with the requirements of the House bill for those cities who choose to adopt their own codes instead of using the model code. The model code must be finalized by December 2020, and it is anticipated that the minimum standards will be finalized at the same time. If we do not amend our code by June 30th, 2022 to comply with the House bill, the model code will apply in Eugene. So why focus on adding middle housing types, and why now? Why adopt this House bill at the state level? This bill was passed in part to address the deepening housing affordability and availability crisis in the state, but it also begins to reverse a long history of exclusionary policies and codes that were developed in cities across the country in the 1920s. US exclusionary laws have their roots in the history of slavery. In Oregon, non-white people were excluded from even living in the state, which was written into our Constitution from 1844 until 1926. During the 1920s, zoning ordinances were created by local governments to separate land uses and people. Residential zoning was used to exclude low-income people, as well as Black, Indigenous, and people of color from certain neighborhoods. Exclusionary zoning is the practice of creating areas for single detached homes where other types of homes are excluded, and separate areas for every other kind of housing from duplexes to apartments. This connection between housing policy, zoning, and racial equity is well documented in Richard Rothstein's 2017 book, The Color of Law. There's also good documentation of redlining, the practice of excluding Black neighborhoods from real estate lending in cities around the country, including Portland, which you can see in the map on the lower right. Eugene's history is less well documented. We do have a few local resources on our website, and we're working to find more. We have a long way to go, but we're excited to take this opportunity to purposefully integrate anti-racism into our planning work. I've been a planner for 23 years in Oregon, and this is the first time I have seen us directly addressing our profession's racist history instead of using more general terms like social equity and justice. Later, Sophie will talk about how we intend to further equity and inclusion through our public involvement activities. But first, here's a look at Eugene's zoning map. The city will be required to amend zoning standards in all residentially zoned areas. As you can see, a large majority of the city is zoned R1 in the cream color on the map. We'll also need to amend R2, R3, R4, and some special area zones. To make sure we're all on the same page, let's meet the housing types called out in the bill. A duplex is simply 2 units on a lot. A triplex, 3 units on a lot. And a fourplex is 4 units on a lot. A cottage cluster is a small group of individual homes centered on common open space. Townhouses or row houses are usually 2-story homes attached in a row with front stoops or porches. Our team produced a missing middle handbook a few years ago that we have on our website, and that showcases examples of middle housing types that exist in Eugene, often without drawing a lot of notice due to their house-like design. There's also a middle housing walking tour you can take to view these different types from the sidewalk. Here's a look at our project implementation timeline. You may see some similarities here to other processes such as the Clear and Objective Standards Code Amendment work. It's a basic 4-step process, starting with public involvement planning and project approach. Phase 2, we go into developing designs and code concepts. Phase 3 is about writing the code language and revising it. And phase 4 will be the local adoption process. For each phase, we've listed some public engagement strategies below, but they're too small for you to see. So Sophie's going to spend some time now walking you through the public involvement plan. Sophie.
Thanks, Terry. These are unprecedented times. COVID-19 has completely changed the world we live in and the way we work. And at the same time, our country is experiencing powerful messages and efforts regarding the Black Lives Matter movement. Both will have an impact on our messaging and how we engage with the community. We are living in a pandemic, and current health recommendations prohibit our usual large in-person gatherings. This means that our engagement will shift to include mostly virtual opportunities to engage, a challenge and an opportunity for the city to expand who we can hear from. Efforts such as the Healthy Democracy Panel, online forums, use of social media, mobile-friendly web page design, and new creative tactics will be used. Ultimately, the project team is committed to an inclusive approach that removes barriers and results in community-wide participation. We recognize that this approach is new and will be imperfect, and we'll be learning and adjusting along the way. Then there is the intersection of this project and the Black Lives Matter movement. To move forward, we must first look back and acknowledge actions in the past that have harmed and excluded members of our community. We cannot talk about zoning without talking about race and exclusion. Residential zoning has a complex history that resulted in exclusion of low income, as well as Black, Indigenous, and people of color from certain neighborhoods. And as Terry said, this history was especially harmful in Oregon. Although those exclusions are illegal today, their negative impacts are still affecting our community through the legacy of exclusionary zoning. Housing policy and code changes are an opportunity to mitigate those. A component of the public involvement plan will be to educate the public about this history and the connection between housing policy, zoning, and equity. These efforts will include hosting historical information on the project webpage, linking to relevant books in the Eugene Public Library, and collaborating with the library to link to research about Eugene zoning's specific history with white supremacy and exclusion of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We also plan on hosting community conversations with local experts and organizations on social media that discuss the effects of exclusionary zoning. Our profession's history is harmful, and its future is dependent on righting our wrongs and committing to change. Revising our land use code to comply with House Bill 2001 will shape how our community develops and expand opportunities for where people can choose to live and what type of home they can live in. We have the opportunity to use land use code changes to make our neighborhoods more inclusive and more equitable for everyone to enjoy. With all that being said, let's talk about public engagement strategies and who we aim to engage. The City Council will have a key role in this project. After we develop implementation options, you will review land use code amendments and adopt a new code that allows more housing types in more places. Before that, we are going to pilot a new way to hear from more perspectives in our community than we usually have. We plan on partnering with a Portland nonprofit called Healthy Democracy to assemble a community review board, a randomly selected panel that is representative of Eugene demographics and perspectives. This panel will be compensated for their time and will provide a truly democratic perspective to the process. While this effort is intended to bring more voices into the room, it is important to acknowledge that a randomly selected panel in Eugene would reflect a white dominant perspective and additional work must be done. Therefore, we plan on hosting several local partner roundtables, which will include an equity roundtable that will be comprised of a variety of partners such as leaders in the community from Black, Indigenous, and people of color identified groups, Eugene Springfield Renters Alliance, and GLAAD, formerly the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation. This roundtable will provide an equity lens, and participants will be compensated for their time. In addition to the equity roundtable, we will host another roundtable that will include stakeholders, local partners, and boards and commissions. And then, of course, we plan on engaging with the general public. As I've mentioned, due to COVID-19, we will rely primarily on online engagement strategies. This includes a project webpage that will host information and resources, emailed city newsletters, and Engage Eugene, which will host online open houses, online office hours, presentations, surveys, and Q&A. Then we are going to have to get creative and innovative. We will use social media that will build on our current presence and expand to include live videos, Twitter, Instagram, and forums. We also plan on creating materials like the City of Minneapolis's Meeting in a Box, which is creating printable and digital meeting materials for local organizations, neighborhood associations, and other interested parties to provide feedback on the project without having staff present or having to attend a public meeting. Tools like this are new, but we've seen their success in other places, and we hope that this makes the information more accessible for a broader range of community members.
Thank you, Sophie. So that was an overview of our project approach and public involvement activities. Our next steps are to take your feedback, revise our public involvement plan, and bring it to the Planning Commission for their approval in their role as the city's Citizen Involvement Committee. And that will happen at a meeting in August. Then we'll launch our major public involvement activities and begin the work on design concepts and code work. And now we look forward to your questions and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I very much appreciate this presentation. It is a kind of a first step out for us to, I see you, Betty, to really be using this lens of our racist history as a way of looking at our zoning, and to be very transparent and kind of overt and direct about that. So I appreciate that effort and really am inspired by the outreach effort. So thank you for that. I have Betty and then Alan.
Thank you. First, I'm very disturbed to see this turned into something about race, which I do not think it was at all. And also, I think that your talk about online is discriminatory against poor people and old people. Many old people, I'm an old person, but because I'm on the council, I know how to use a computer somewhat. But lots of older people don't have the technical ability, and lots of poor people cannot afford computers. And the ones who can't afford to buy them maybe can't afford the upkeep. And I think also it's illogical to say that we're excluding people, that those things, they're no longer happening. It's no longer true that if you're Black, you can't buy a house in a certain neighborhood. It's been a long time in Eugene since that's been true, and most places it's not true anymore. But we're concerned with Eugene. This law is a really bad law. I think we should resist it with every possible means. And I know some communities, at least they were say they were going to ignore it, but at least there's no rush. If we have a date of a deadline of 6/30/22, I don't know what they're going to do to cities at that point, but how they can make them do things. But at least we don't have to rush, and we could wait and see what the land use board comes up with, and see if that's worse than what we might do. And also another thing disturbs me. I don't know when we started paying volunteers. There's been a long history of volunteerism in this country, and in civic groups, church groups, all kinds of groups rely on volunteers, and a volunteer means you don't get paid. You volunteer. I'm disturbed about that too. But why do we have to rush if we have a debt? What we should be doing is working for the repeal of this terrible law, and letting people who wish to work to defeat the legislators who voted for it. There is time for that. And at least we could wait until see how bad the LCDC plan is. Maybe you don't even have to do the work if you're planning to do something just as bad. When you talk about, I'm watching the time there. I'll probably want a second round. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Alan and then Emily.
Yeah, I'm not against HB 2001 in principle, and I agree we need more affordable housing options. My problem was the cookie cutter approach that it took. The one size fits all neighborhoods was problematic, especially in the area that I represent, in the area around the University of Oregon. We are likely to see just the exact opposite occur to creating more affordable housing in some, if not a lot of cases, where we will see folks tearing down older single family affordable housing in homes and building new market-based, not affordable housing, quads and things like that for students. So, and the ancillary impacts to neighborhoods because of the added people that are going in there and the nature of the types of housing that are going in there. So, this basically does away with R1 zoning. But it may well work in other parts of the city and work well, especially around the transit corridors that we have. So I think that it has its place, but I think it was misplaced to just do it cookie cutter and not think about the unintended consequences that are going to occur in different parts of the city. Regarding the public involvement plan, I like it. I think it's a very creative response to our dual crisis of COVID-19 and racism that we're addressing right now. I think about the long-term impacts. I've been thinking about that and what we are doing right now, whether or not that's going to stick, and whether or not what we're doing is trying to institutionalize being more inclusionary and more inclusive of people that don't typically have voice in processes like this. And I think processes like this, which is kind of our first one out the door, where we purposefully institutionalize that kind of outreach will, I think, allow us in the long term to address those issues in a far better way than we have in the past, and in some cases just ignore. So finally, I think I'm good with the reimbursement of people. I think that has often been a barrier to allowing people to participate that aren't of the economic means to be able to participate. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was a power manager at Emerald PUD, we paid people that was 30 years ago, we paid people to participate in our resource planning processes that we had. So this isn't a new idea, but I think it's something that it is new to the city of Eugene, but it's been around for a long time. And I think it has good impacts, I think, in allowing people to be participatory. Thanks.
Thank you. Emily and then Claire.
Thank you, Mayor. I have a couple of pretty basic questions. What are the kinds of differences that we'd be looking at between the model code and minimum standard deviations and what we would do in the city? Like Betty says, we don't know what the model code is yet, but I'm not sure which things we are thinking about changing, so that would really help. And I guess that's part of what the groups are going to talk about. And my other question is, if the larger buildings are not on every lot, but allowed in areas, what decides which lots in those areas get them and which don't? So those are two important questions for me to consider this.
I can do a short response if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. To your first question, yes, because the model code and minimum standards are being discussed actively right now, we're in a bit of a holding pattern to see what they look like, and are anticipating waiting and having the consultants that the city hires respond to those. And so we won't be presenting you with a draft code until we know what those look like, and we can respond and thoughtfully describe what the differences would be between proposed Eugene specific approach and a model code or minimum standards. Just as an example of something that could be different, could be required lot size for some of the bigger units. And that is something that is being discussed by the committees right now, how to deal with that and how to put standards for the different types into both the code and the minimum standards. As far as in areas, it's a similar answer in that that's actively being discussed as to what could be the distinguishing factors of one area versus another. There are a couple different ways of thinking about that that are being discussed by the committees. It appears that the committees and staff are leaning towards a more liberal application of types across the city. And I welcome Councilor Pryor to jump in because he's been a part of some of those committee meetings. But there's also an active conversation of city reps and other folks asking for more flexibility. And so that hasn't been resolved yet and will be resolved ideally by November when the model code and standards are adopted.
So what will the groups be talking about if we don't have that information yet? I mean, don't want to waste people's time talking about what ifs, and that's what this seems like to me.
Yeah, that's a great question. We anticipate shifting from getting into what different code standards might look like, instead kind of front loading the conversation about what middle housing types are, how zoning and housing policy affect everyone in the city. So as was described in our talk about past participation and how this is different, one of the things we're really trying to do is raise awareness about the fact that housing policy and zoning do impact every resident in the city. And folks that we have managed to include in our committees and advisory bodies in the past have been a small slice of voices. And so the primary goal, I think, of the Healthy Democracy Panel is to intentionally reach out to every corner of the city and as many demographic categories as possible to begin to educate folks and share information about how these things affect different parts of our city. That will take some time, just getting up and running with the committee. And then we will keep them on so they can develop some kind of expectations in the first half of the public involvement, and then react to consultant products and staff products in the second half of the process. And we are in this chicken and egg situation of waiting for products to come out of the state, but we are also still under a deadline to get it adopted by the middle of 2022 and to spend grant money that the state has given us. So we do have a tight timeline, but we're attempting to shift the way that the hours are spent a little bit to respond to some of those conditions.
I just don't think that really makes sense. So we're going to convene these groups and basically spend a few months educating them about the possible issues, which I think that's a fine thing to do, but I'm not sure that it's very productive considering that everything could change. So I like including every groups, and you've certainly covered many ideas of ways for people to be connected even without being able to do it in person. But I'm not convinced that we need 3 months of meetings and paying people before there's something to really talk about. So that's a concern of mine. Thank you.
Okay, Claire.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the presentation. I really appreciate the way you are looking at this process. I agree with your analysis that our housing code reflects an exclusionary mindset that Oregon had from its inception, and that this process represents an opportunity to move past that legacy and create a more truly inclusive code and therefore hopefully neighborhoods. And I got to attend a planning commission meeting last week, and I heard there that they are also thinking about things through that lens, and I believe, you know, are intending to be more mindful about how that legacy plays out in our code. And then I appreciate your response around, you know, kind of front loading these conversations so that people who are being engaged in a conversation about code for the first time in their adult lives, you know, get a good foundation of what that means, what the implications are for that. And I also think even if we get, you know, a certain far down the road with that conversation, and then we get, you know, these model codes from this other process, we still will have gained information. We still will have input and contribution from those conversations that we wouldn't have had otherwise. So I don't think I agree that they would be a waste of time unless we were really getting down into the weeds and giving them very specific code things and asking them to, you know, wordsmith them. So I did want to ask, so generally speaking, I think your outreach plan is good. I did want to ask about providing translation service so we can work with folks whose English is not their first language, if that's part of the plan.
Yeah, we just started talking about that. And I think we're trying to determine what makes the most sense and where to provide that service. We absolutely want to do it if it's needed and offer it. But we're not sure if we'll need it for the community panel or more for the equity roundtable. That piece is a little bit closer in nature to the climate action plan equity panel. And translation services were provided for that. And so that's the current thinking, but since we haven't actually recruited the panelists yet, we don't know if it's a need. And if it's a need, we'll have to figure out how to address it.
Okay. And then I just also want to encourage you to try and expand who's involved in terms of the individual. So we're not burning out the same people who have raised their hand to participate in city activities. And, you know, the folks who are participating now may be able to recommend others who could be invited to participate and expand that circle. And then I also support the compensation piece. If we really want a diverse group of residents to participate in these processes, we can't just limit it to people who can afford to give us their time for free. That's, you know, Betty expressed a concern about poor people, and that would be in line with that thinking. I do share her concern about the online piece, and I don't know if there's any thoughts around doing some outreach at, you know, like grocery stores with masks and social distance, where people would have a chance to engage in a conversation in person rather than having to rely on technology. So it's one last thought. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, I have Chris, and then Mike, then Jennifer.
Thank you. This is very helpful for me. As you know, I serve on the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, and I'm representing elected officials on there. There's a lot of technical expertise, a lot of people who represent housing, and I'm there kind of to represent the policymakers' point of view. And it's been true that there has been a large debate between the people who represent cities and have to implement this to seek whatever flexibility we can have in terms of being able to say, you're right, one size does not fit all. And Alan, very rightly so, recognizes that his ward near the university has different issues than other wards. At the same time, other people on the committee are saying, yeah, but flexibility is one way you can use to exclude. In other words, I use the flexibility as an escape clause to be able to get my area excluded and this area excluded because my size just doesn't fit. My size just doesn't fit. So what they're trying to do is figure out a way to reconcile the fact that there are differences, but that you don't use those differences as an excuse to keep people out. And that over time, that has been the case. They've seen it in other cities, and they have examples of how you can use the law as a way to keep people out. And the Planning Commission presentation that Claire referred to was done by the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, who sits on the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. And one of the most interesting things for me about that presentation was that because Oregon was so successful at keeping African Americans and Indigenous people and Black people out of the state for so long, they had to find other peoples that they could discriminate against and hate. And so we came up with whole new forms of discrimination that we could use. Catholics, Jews, Muslims, poor people, people who were this way or that way. So we not only discriminate in all the historical ways we need to be vigilant about, but we've also learned whole new forms of discrimination. If you're from California, you're a Californicator, I hate you. If you're from this place, I hate you. If you're poor, we want to discriminate against you. I'm even hearing now, renters. We need to discriminate against renters. They're not real homeowners. They're not real people who live in homes, because if they were real people, they would own a home. They don't rent. And so we need to be very careful about the forms of discrimination that are going on that don't just involve color. We can't say, well, I don't discriminate against color, therefore I'm okay. I'm not a discriminatory person. Yeah, there's all kinds of discrimination going on. Look at the swastikas being drawn all over town, and you begin to realize there's a lot of discrimination going on. And what we need to do is make sure that doesn't color our thinking as we look at discussions about housing.
Okay, Mike, and then Jennifer.
Thank you, Mayor. Three things. Number one, I'm entirely fine with the work towards increasing equity and inclusion. That's great. I think that's awesome that we're considering that and how we go about this. I think one of the reasons you do that is because we want to make sure that we hear about everybody's different experience in life, the things that they've experienced, the things that people who look like them have experienced. And you want to make sure that you take all of those points of view into account and not just some. And that, for me, that makes a great amount of sense. Where my problem comes in is that we're going to re-educate people before we ask them about their opinions and their experiences. So I think the reason for the expansion of inclusion and equity is great. But if they don't already know that those issues exist, then I'm kind of I'm struggling with the point. And certainly I have concerns of exactly what it is that we're going to be presenting to people as truth and fact in such a case, because there could be some controversial parts of that that are perhaps a bit more political than factual. But be that as it may, I don't have a problem with the people and the manner in which you're going to invite people to participate. Secondarily, Betty, to take off a little bit more on what Betty and Alan said, I agree entirely. This bill is both dangerous and wrong. It won't do, this new law, not bill, it's already been passed. I'm hoping that the legislature in its wisdom will reconsider this and get much smarter because it's dangerous and it won't work. Dangerous, number one, it's now critically clear that density in jurisdictions creates greater capacity for disease to grow. You look at any of the most dense communities in our country, and that's where the COVID virus is having the worst outcomes. Density kills people in this new environment we live in, and we need to take that into consideration, and certainly I hope the state legislature does. But to Alan's point is exactly right. This is designed to create more affordable middle housing. I think, by the way, I'm the only person on the screen that actually lives in middle housing types in a duplex, but it's created intentionally to create more affordable housing. And it's absolutely not going to succeed as written in doing that. As someone in this industry, I promise you that what will happen as a net effect is there'll be considerably less affordable housing as a result of this full implementation. So I really hope the legislature changes mind, and I think Betty's right, we should fight it. Thank you.
Mayor, can I hop in at some point?
Yes, Jennifer, and then you, Greg.
Okay.
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks, Terry and Sophie. That was a very succinct and easy to understand presentation about a lot of stuff, and I really appreciate it. And Emily asked some of my questions, so that was great. I wanted to say I really like the engagement plan that you guys came up with. I remember when I started in neighborhoods, I knew zoning existed, but if someone had asked me any other question other than do zoning codes exist, that would have been the end of my knowledge. So front-ending this with education so that people can then make informed feedback, I think is really smart. And just the general concept that we need to do a better job of engaging with our community in meaningful ways, like, is great no matter what the topic is. So I think these are really good opportunities for us to reach out into our community, and I'm glad that we're doing it. I also wanted to say, I think the idea of having the links back to library books, that's very creative, and just finding ways to cross our departments and support each other in those ways, so that people are like, they may have been like, oh, I wish I knew more about this. Oh, there's a link. Like, that's so smart. And I'm really glad you guys are looking for those opportunities to help each other do this work and to educate people. And since my questions were already answered, that's all I have.
Okay, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. This is not just a zoning issue. If it were just a zoning issue, I might have a different take on it. But let me just tell you this. In 1959, my mother and father bought the house that I grew up in an all-white neighborhood. My father was the first to break the color line and go across 154th Street. But within 5 years, the whole area had been resegregated. And so white people literally disappeared by the time I got into kindergarten. The thing that my folks struggle with, and that was some blockbusting stuff by realtors that, wanted to make money and off of the racial dynamics that existed then. But, the other thing that I think that we should look at and consider is the practices of lenders, particularly banks, and also insurance companies, because we didn't get our mortgage from a bank. My church didn't get a mortgage from a bank. It got a mortgage from a savings and loan, and they don't exist anymore. And so, if we're talking about the issues of race, and right now we don't have a quote unquote neighborhood in Eugene, and people are not segregated by color, but more segregated by economic circumstances and the ability to, pay a mortgage, maintain insurance, and keep up a property. Those are the things that I would like to see us delve into a little further as we're trying to adhere with HB 2001, is the other barriers that exist, and how we can work to remove those barriers, particularly when we talk about commercial bank lending and insurance.
Okay, thank you. Terry, do you have any comments on that suggestion from Greg, just before we go on to the second round?
I think I would just say it's very much part of the literature, especially in the book, The Color of Law. As it relates to what we can do as a city, I'd have to get back to you on that and talk with our economic development folks.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Mayor, I got one other thing for Terry. Can you research, do you know if, and find out if other cities have code on the books that deal with lending discrimination and insurance discrimination?
That's a great question. We'll add it to our list of questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And I have Betty and Alan for a second, Betty, Alan, and Mike for second rounds. So take it away, Betty.
Thank you. Well, first, I think we all think of our own experiences, and women especially, I've been told. But when you talk about educating people who are poor to know how to do things, I was a volunteer and an active in civic affairs when I was very poor and lived on the wrong side of town. And when hoity-toity people came to my house for committee meetings, they talked about leaving their car lights on to be sure it was safe, which was an exaggeration of the actual circumstances. But people can know about civic affairs while they are poor or while they live on the wrong end of town. And that's just condescending to say that they imply that they can't. But I totally agree with Mike on this, on part of this at least. The affordability will disappear instead of being increased. And it isn't just in Ellen's ward, it is in my ward and a lot of places in town where people will sell their houses to someone who wants to build a triplex or a fourplex and make a lot of money. And those places will not be for rent cheap, for sale or rent cheap. They will cost more perhaps than the house that was demolished. And we don't have a lot of affordable housing left. It's getting less and less affordable what there is, but somewhat affordable housing. And people will have their eyes on those to make money. Also, and this is where I don't agree with Mike, but another topic, we just did nothing about STRs, which are helping to destroy some affordable housing. Not huge amounts perhaps, but some, and maybe more in the future. So it's rather strange that we're now talking about preserving affordable housing. But just ask the people who live around Willamette Street, for example, where when we were about to change the zoning there, some houses had already been sold to people who wanted to demolish them. That's what I was told by people who live there, and I believe them. This is, I think, we should put all our energy now. We have until 2022, and I won't be there to complain, but we have, but there's time to do what has to be done, if it really does have to be done. But we should put a lot of energy into trying to get this terrible law repealed. Even some of the people who voted for it know that it's a terrible law, and it wouldn't take a lot of votes. And thank you. That's all.
Okay, Alan and then Mike.
Thanks, Mayor. When I started, before I got on the council, a lot of the things that got me involved in this was planning and zoning and development that was happening in the neighborhoods. And, and over my 20 plus years of being involved, I've learned a lot, but it's not something that is intuitive. It's the planning and zoning and all that kind of stuff is very arcane, very complicated, and it's difficult to understand. And so, and it's a whole set of knowledge that you don't naturally come by unless you dive into it. So I firmly believe that meaningful public input comes from being from a place of knowledge and being informed. Back in my Emerald PUD days, when I was leading planning exercises for electric utility, we would run people through a basically 401 college level course on all the different options, tell them everything they needed to know about what they needed, and then we would ask them their opinion about what to do. But that knowledge base is so critical to have meaningful public involvement. So kind of like a planning zoning boot camp is really critical for people to be able to understand and have meaningful input. So I think that that's a critical step for that kind of input, and it can be done prior to the model code coming out. And I think that's the plan, right, Terry, is to get people through this and educate them. And when the model plan comes out, then we can, so we're not deciding a whole bunch of stuff and then the model comes out and then we'll have to redo everything because we didn't do it right or didn't take into consideration what we thought was going to happen and it was completely different. So we're going to train them and then the model code's going to come out and then we'll ask them what their opinion is. I got that right?
Yeah, that's the general sequence. Again, we don't have a huge amount of time, but that is our intention in getting started early and really prepping people to engage is to start now and track what's going on at the state level so that we're aware of what issues are going to need to be discussed. Yeah, just harkening back to my Emerald PUD days, we not only paid them a little small stipend, I think it was $20 back then, but we also fed them, and that was very important to get people to come to the meetings.
Okay, Mike, then Claire.
Yes, it's one of the reasons I enjoy council is because I am often fed. I agree.
The food.
Yeah, the food. That's a big deal. I wanted to address some of the things that Greg said, just as somebody who is a mortgage lender and a mortgage loan officer for a living. After the 2008 and 9 housing crisis, the federal government stepped in with a very large footprint to very intensely regulate the mortgage lending business in a way that it hadn't been before. You compare what came before the Wild West compared to the way the regulatory structure at the federal level exists today, exactly in order to prevent discriminatory lending. A loan officer like myself is licensed at the state, so the state has a regulatory branch that deals with it and holds a license number, more or less, that is a registry that's done at the federal level. So I don't know that because of the existence of all of the federal and state laws that pertain, that the local level could add, perhaps they could, but I don't know that that's possible. But I would say that today is an entirely different atmosphere than was the case even as little as 9 or 10 years ago. And there are an immense list of remedies for people who imagine that they have or think that there's reason and cause to believe they've been treated with discrimination in the lending process. I'd love to take a look at it, but I can tell you that there's considerable literature on that, and entire organizations and parts of government in order to take care of it. The CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, was created with the intention of ensuring that people were treated fairly in lending. And so there, like I said, we could take a look at it, but I would say that that's been addressed in legislation in a way that zoning has not. And so I'm in favor of taking a look at that too. Thank you.
Claire, and then Emily.
Thanks. Well, I wanted to respond because I think Councilor Taylor might have been referring to my comments when she said it was condescending to imply that people who are lower income couldn't be taught or learn to engage in civic participation. And I certainly did not say that or imply it. That would be a ridiculous position for anyone to take. I was simply pointing out that if we assume that people can volunteer and give their time for free, we're actually reducing the level of participation from folks who may be having to work an hourly job and still go into the grocery store to work, or whatever other occupation out there that people still have to show up in person for, can't do via Zoom. And I would say if we look at our boards and commissions and even the history of who has participated on this council, we would see that the demographic tends to lean towards, folks at the middle or higher level income and or, retirees. And so I think offering a modest stipend for people to participate levels the playing field in terms of, gets closer to leveling the playing field in terms of who all from our community can participate. I was not implying what anyone's ability to do so is connected to their income, but their opportunity to do so is what I was referring to.
Emily, and then Chris.
And Mayor?
About the comments on education, thinking about it, I realized that on the budget committee, we don't get the budget until April. And depending on the year and what's happening, we meet a bunch of times before that, both on general budget and particular issues. So I realized that if I was reviewing zoning, I would like to know more about zoning first. I'm not against paying people to be able to participate in this. I don't want to be spending money needlessly, but I really do want a broader participation on these committees and commissions and workshops. And it's true, council, we get people who are employed or retired or, like me, willing to live pretty much in poverty. And so that eliminates a lot of people and their voices are lost. And so I think we owe it to be paying extra attention to that, especially now. I agree, this isn't a good law. I don't like it. We worked really hard in the beginning to not go along with it. I think home rule is critical. And I also want to be realistic about our time and energy on fighting it. And I am interested in what it's going to actually be and what options we have to modify it. And that seems like a big unknown. Maybe that it would turn out to be not quite as horrible as I think. So maybe in an ideal world when we didn't have all these traumas, I'd want to fight it. But right now I'm interested in what it's going to be, what challenges there are, and what we will be able to do with whatever is presented to us. So thank you.
Chris, and then Greg.
Thank you. This has been a really interesting conversation. I really appreciate it. I think this law has passed, and I think the chance that it will be rescinded is minimal. So I think what we have to do is to try to figure out the best and most thoughtful way that we can incorporate it into our planning process. And to say, well, we've got until June of 2022. In the world of planning, that's a heartbeat. That it takes a long time to put codes together, to have hearings on them, to get them implemented. And so we do need to start now, particularly if we really are intentional about trying to create a code that reflects our local needs as much as possible while still meeting the requirements of House Bill 2001. So no, we can't wait. We have to start now, particularly if we acknowledge that this is the law. And back when it was being proposed, there was an opportunity for us to have influence on how it was shaped and how it was put together, but we decided we didn't want to do that. We wanted to just fight it. So now we're stuck with what it is, and we're going to have to try to work with that. The rulemaking committee is one place where we can try to incorporate in the actual model code ways to influence that flexibility, ways to do things. And I think that's what we're trying to do now. And I think it's as thoughtful as it can be. But I don't want to leave it up to Salem to decide all the nuances and ins and outs of what we need to do here at the local level. So I'm pleading that we get started as soon as possible so that we can get a model code that's good for Eugene and still abides by House Bill 2001, but reflects what it is we really want to try to do here as much as we possibly can. And we're going to have to start that now. And part of that process is incorporating the community in that conversation. And whereas it used to be that I thought, yeah, volunteerism is volunteerism. And if you want to be a part of government, you have to be willing to step up and volunteer. But I have learned over the years that that's a way that consciously or unconsciously, certain people are excluded from participation. I have kids. I can't go to those meetings. Who's going to watch my kids? I don't have transportation. I can't do this. I can't do that. So I think we've reached a point where if you truly want good, diverse representation, you have to consider reimbursing people in some way, shape, or form for their participation, or you're just going to get the same folks that you've always gotten. So I've completely turned around on that. So I'm comfortable with compensating people, or at least reimbursing them. But I think we need that participation, and we need to get started now.
Thank you. Greg?
Yeah, I agree with Chris on that. There is a sense of urgency to get this done. The way I looked at this when it first came out was that this was a Portland problem seeking a solution. By mandating cities under 25,000 to go through this exercise, I don't think that was prudent or strategic. I do, however, know, and to respond to what Mike said, is we got a lot of laws on the books, and a lot of those laws people just ignore or don't pay any attention to, and they keep doing the same things that they've been doing in the past. What I'm seeing is particularly with poor people and people of color, is the access to affordable housing, no matter where it's located, and how we can provide more access for people to get there. Home ownership is one side of it, but the rental side is another. And then we have the SDRs that are involved in this too, to some degree. But I really think, yes, we need to begin to move forward and to comply with the state law. But at the same time, I think that we need to recognize nuances that the law does not address, and barriers that are raised not necessarily because of what the law covers, but because of what the law doesn't cover. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. I just want to wrap up with one other comment, which is in response to both Betty and Mike talking about missing middle housing is not going to be affordable housing, and we know that. And as a council, you know that, and you have acted on that information. It was the motivation behind the housing tools and strategies, which is how do we make it more affordable to build more housing that people can afford? How do we increase that availability? What are those strategies? And within that, you passed a construction excise tax also in order to enable it to pencil out better. So you've acknowledged that. We do know that we're not in total control of the market, and our goal is to try to increase the supply. And I know that Mike is going to dispute this on any number of levels, and I can see him nodding. But you have acted on that and have acknowledged that just encouraging the creation of missing middle housing is not a complete answer by any stretch of the imagination to the housing supply crisis that we face at all levels. And but this is one very, very important step in order to retain our urban growth boundary and still be able to increase the amount of housing units we have available. So I thank you. I think the engagement plan is interesting and powerful, and appreciate the work on that. And I think unless there are any other final comments or questions, we are adjourned. Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.